It's late spring. Means the grass is getting greener, the buds are coming out, there's a lot of flowering, there's a lot of activity. You're getting to hear the songbirds for the first time in months. People are going out in shorts and t-shirts. Winter jackets are going away. The last piles of snow have melted. And again, as happens every year, another cohort of similarly aged young people finish their high school experience. And there'll be other young people, slightly older, who are going to be finishing their college experience. But I wanted to talk more about the high school experience at this point. And I've made videos about this before. This is one of the topics that I'm very, very interested in. It's a very disheartening topic, especially when we consider how much potential is wasted as a result. But education is one of the most abysmal parts of our society. It's one of the most underperforming, one of the most coercive, one of the most destructive uh, that we have, and yet there's this enormous disconnect between um, any any recognition of that fact and any idea of what to do about it. It is quite fascinating because if you ask most people, does the education system work or is it really effective? I think most people would admit that there's lots of problems. Now, they may not agree on what the problems were or the extent of the problems, but there are very few people who are just going to say, yeah, it's pretty much good. If you were to go around saying there needs to be radical change or lots of reform or something like that, I think most people would agree that there should be reform, although the nature of those reforms would again vary tremendously between people. However, very few people can kind of envision any system that's very different. There's this widespread kind of assumption that you have to have a government-run compulsory education system that is free for everybody. And no amount of failure of this system as it exists can disqualify people's beliefs in that. And this is yet another, and we have many examples of this, of social proof of conservative bias, of people being brought up in a certain system and then just assuming or taking for granted the assumptions of that system and then giving them so much added weight in their considerations that it's very difficult for them to imagine anything different. And uh, I think that is a tragedy. It's something that hurts our society every year. And I didn't always used to think this. I went to public schools. I believed very firmly in education. I still believe very firmly in education in the general sense. And I believed that anybody who didn't take their studies fairly seriously was a Luddite and was a fool, and that there really wasn't any better way for somebody to spend their time growing up than in school. But I think that it's undeniable that many of the assumptions that gird that uh, perspective are faulty. So I want to talk about some of those assumptions and some of the costs that those impose on our society, which I think are considerable. Um, so assumption number one is that there is some kind of general pedagogy that is kind of best for everybody, that there's some kind of curriculum that is uniformly beneficial that everyone should follow. And if this isn't your belief, if you believe that people are radically different and that different people should have different curricula, then you are talking about an assumption that does not lend itself to the current system nearly as much. There are basic ideas about egalitarianism that don't square when you have people with divergent needs. If we're going on the assumption of giving everybody, quote, what they need, and if people need different things, then different people are going to get different resources. And that does not mesh well with the general rhetoric of the universal public schoolists. So I would posit that there isn't, in fact, a general curriculum. Now, you can be extremely vague here. You could say, well, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And there might be something satisfying in being that general. But I would question that. First of all, I would just question that. I do wonder how much arithmetic people need to actually know. anything beyond very elementary levels are rarely used by most people. So, yes, people do addition and subtraction and maybe multiplication, but that's not even that common for your average person. And it's rather rare that people use algebra. Now, there's lots of situations, an infinite number of situations where algebra or calculus or geometry might be useful, but your average person is not encountering them or can avoid them or can appeal to specialized, people, either experts or, this day and age, their smartphone to answer those questions. And so I would question, uh, the degree that arithmetic is something. But then even that term, I guess arithmetic specifically would mean just addition. But uh, I don't know. Does arithmetic mean any equations? I'm not sure. But you know, when people say that, do they mean multiplication tables, or do they mean you need to know calculus, or that you need to be able to do differential equations or all that? And there's a huge difference in terms of what the schools ought to be doing based on your answer. Are we, is the point of the system to get everybody as far as they individually can go? So say you have a really gifted student and they can, they're very smart, and what are we going to design a system so that they're taking calculus in eighth grade, and by the time they finish 12th grade that they're doing, NASA physics level calculations? Or, and then somebody else where, hey, if they can count all 10 of their fingers, we're going to call it good. That's the best we can hope for. Those are radically different curriculums per pupil. And when you multiply how many different people that there are and how divergent their abilities and proclivities are, that's an astronomically complex, pedagogy to implement. One that I don't think anyone in their right mind can imagine that public education would even remotely approximate. And the same is true with reading, and the same is true with writing. When you say you need to be able to read, does that mean you just need to be able to sign your name or to make, phonate very basically? Or does that mean that you need to be able to recite poetry, that you need to be able to read Shakespeare, that you need to speak other languages? It helps you to know English to know other languages, right? You learn the etymology and the, the parts of speech and the various laws of grammar. I learned more about grammar learning Icelandic than I ever learned in school. And I don't think I could really put a financial price tag or sales pitch on that information, how valuable it was to me. I found it kind of interesting, but I don't know if it was worth the time I put into it. So again, we can be super general and say, oh yeah, everyone should know X, Y, and Z, but it turns out that there is a spectrum and a expansive potential curriculum within each one of those. Each X, Y, and Z could include all kinds of different things. And so when you get to specifics, you find that there really isn't. And people debate this very, very heavily. The kind of the tendency, and this is true with basically everything with the government, is every individual person has their own subjective values and preferences that they, accept more or less uncritically. And they kind of project that and believe, look, so let's say you like physical education and you like music and you like math, but you're not that much into physics and you're not that much into, say, I don't know, home ec. And so then you kind of project and say, well, the best curriculum would basically mirror that. And then there's this added step of then kind of assuming that the government either should or actually is doing that. So there's a lot of people who will rationalize a compulsory government provision of a good and service on the basis of it providing that good and service exactly the way that they idealize that it should be, regardless of the fact of whether or not the government is actually doing that or even trying to do that. I guess you could always hypothetically say you're the king of the world and the public school system is going to teach everything that you think it should in exactly the way that you think it should to exactly the people you think it should. That's not actually what's happening, though. And there's an open question of whether your justification for a system based on it meeting some hypothetical idealized standard versus what it actually does is really a valid argument, right? If we're going to say public schools are justified because they're going to provide this idealized perfect curriculum to everybody, and then it turns out that that's practically not possible, is the justification for public schools then eliminated? So no, I don't think that there is People differ too much in their interests. People differ too much in their abilities. The ability of teachers to provide that information isn't the same, right? So there are teachers out there who are probably very qualified at teaching certain things to certain people, but then not very qualified to teaching other things to other people. So there's people who probably can teach math to one person and other people who probably can't. And the idea that you are going to perfectly match the consumers and the providers is quite ridiculous. There's very little chance that's going to happen, especially in a compulsory system. So, that first assumption that people have that there's this general, idealized curriculum is wrong. And now you could say, well, there's not one curriculum, but there's some number of curriculums. There's the special needs curriculum, and then the gifted and talented curriculum, and then the average curriculum. But unless you're breaking this down, to the essentially to the point of the individual, you're going to have enormous opportunity costs, where you're going to have curriculums that are catered to some kind of average. And even if you have, it's a tiered system and you have 4 or 5 different tiers, well, there's not 4 or 5 tiers of individuals. There's as many individuals as there are individuals. And even if there are certain commonalities between some of them, they're going to be common in some ways and non-common in others. So there's that. And this kind of really does, there's this very strong egalitarian rhetoric used to justify public schools, along with most other programs that the government does, that just breaks down when you start having differential curriculums per pupil. Oh, so this guy needs to learn how to tie his shoes and count his fingers, and this person needs to, be on a hockey team and do robotics and whatever else. You're like, those are, one is going to have way more resources than the other, or vice versa, or need way more time than another, and that's another interesting thing. If there's kind of a minimal base, the idea that we want people to get to a certain level, well, then people are going to not reach that level at the same time. And many people are going to reach that level relatively sooner than others. And if there was to be any kind of coherent logic to that, then you would say, hey, somebody who can meet that minimum should basically be done at that point. If you have somebody who can read at a certain level, can do math at a certain level, then why make them go? And people are very reluctant to do that, even though it would be perfectly logical with that argument. So no, I don't think that there is a standard curriculum, and I don't think that the variant curriculums that you might propose would be optimal. They'd be substantially suboptimal, even if they wouldn't be as bad as a single curriculum. And there's no evidence that the government would be able to do that. So the other problem is just kind of a practical problem of how good are schools at doing anything. Let's just assume whatever the curriculum is, whether there's a generalized one or a plethora of individualized ones, how qualified, how effective are government schools at doing this? And they're not very good at it. Now, it's not to say that it's an easy problem. So I'm not necessarily saying, oh, they're just so incompetent that they can't even do something simple. It's not necessarily that simple, depending on what the curriculum you're talking about is. But they are divorced from the market, so they are divorced from the price incentive. They're divorced from directly interfacing with their consumers, who in this case would either be the students or the parents, depending on how you look at it, because they're going through this involuntary tax cycle. That's how they're getting their income, and their customers are coerced into being there, so they have very little incentive to kind of listen to them, even if they were going to try to. And so they don't have any kind of way to measure it. Now, we have tests, but testing is not to really measure how much the students know so much as just a metric for the schools to measure their own proposals. If the government when the government is spending lots of money, they need to have some kind of bureaucratic means of assessing the expenditure. And standardized testing is basically that. It is a metric for the government to use and saying, oh, okay, well, we just spent, $1 billion on this educational program, and your school's test scores did or did not change accordingly, and so we will now react in a certain way. If they did not have testing, there would just be absolutely no way, no metric for them to even have any kind of now the thing is the metrics itself is kind of pointless. Like the testing itself doesn't predict future outcomes. They don't make the students smarter. They don't have any kind of positive effect. Their time is taken away from actually learning to the extent that that's going on. But it is necessary for the government, for any bureaucracy, to have something that it can point to. And so it generates these metrics, but these metrics are very questionable. And then the other thing is it's it's anecdotally understood that kids don't remember any of the stuff that they're taught beyond the test. And I think this is empirically shown. Something like 80% of the material is forgotten within 2 weeks. And this is something that I think everyone kind of acknowledges and understands. If I was to ask you if you've been out of school for a couple of years to remember what facts you learned, I mean, if I said go and remember your high school years, you're going to remember your friends. You're going to remember, the good times you had, the whatever exciting, the gossipy, the social things, all that. There'll be a lot of memories that you retain from that and a lot of information you remember from that. But I asked you, hey, how do you measure the angle of a isosceles triangle if you know one length and one corner or whatever, or any other kind of bit of information that you were forced to regurgitate in a test. It's probably not that you don't remember any. It's probably not literally zero, but it's awfully close to that. And this has been empirically demonstrated repeatedly. And I think that this is probably the easiest, most accessible kind of rebuke of the system that I can give. Some of the other issues are a little bit more meta, and people are not necessarily that persuaded by things like that. But if you just say, hey, kids don't remember any of this going forward, then what's the point? What's the big argument? Why do we have to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars? And why do we have to coerce kids to go? And that's the big opportunity cost here. I was just talking to somebody, and they were young. They were 18, and they were just finishing high school, and they are they are. It's not prison, but it's close. They are compelled, and point of fact, an 18-year-old is not compelled. An 18-year-old can choose not to go to school, and I'll get to that in a second here. But they are legally required to attend school for so many hours per day, so many hours per year, so many days per year. Complementary to that, the hours that they can work outside of school are limited. The types of jobs they can work outside of school are limited, and they are kind of wedded to their parents in a way that their parents have enormous control over them. And the result is somebody who has just legally limited autonomy to an enormous degree. And the thing is, especially mid and late teens, but even earlier teens to a lesser extent, are capable of much more than that. And the big argument is like, well, they lack experience. They don't have the life experience to kind of manage their lives. And then that becomes a circular argument of then keeping them kind of legally restricted forever because, okay, they're 18, but they've been basically a ward of their parents and the state up until that point, and who's someone who's constantly being babysat by their teachers and by their parents. So they don't have any life experience the minute they turn 18. So they're not ready at that point. So they should probably be kept in a state of perpetual childhood. I think that is kind of a circular argument that people find find much more persuasive than they should, and it's really sad because these young people, are very often very frustrated by this. Now, not many of them are libertarians going around thinking I should be free and these are high opportunity costs and society is oppressing me, but they know that they have ideas. They have ideas of what they want to do, and they are prohibited from doing them, and they're forced to go through these motions. And I think most of them realize at some point, definitely by high school and many by middle school, that it's just a big dog and pony show. They understand, and I know I was this way. I think it was around 8th grade where I was like, the information in these tests are not going to, and it was, for me, it was specifically like geometry. And I was like, well, no one, I mean, if you wanted to become an engineer or an architect, there were certain specific fields where knowing that kind of math and knowing that information might be useful. But if you had no plan to pursue a career like that, or a hobby like that, wouldn't have to be a career. If you're just interested in shapes, you could be interested in shapes. But then there wasn't a lot of reason to do it. Even at the time, they were already dumbing down your calculators so that they wouldn't be able to solve every problem for you. But that's something that we have now, and the idea that, well, you need to expend your mental energy and your time and your effort on something that is redundantly already taken care of by the division of labor with other humans and the division of labor with artificially intelligent machines that can do these calculations for us, um, was something that I think a lot of people understand when they're pretty young. That this was just a kind of a kabuki dance of conformity to show, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to study and I'm going to learn, I'm going to memorize these formulas or whatever, these dates. So I liked history and I enjoyed that, but for many other students, it wasn't. Like, it was this very rote, oh my God, why do I have to know what year the Civil War ended and started? Because seriously, why do you have to know that? Even if I find that very interesting and very useful and it helps my understanding of the world, I can't put a price tag on that. I can't say, that the value of that is objectively such, and that and there's no better thing a person could do. No, there's lots of things. If you were interested in something else, if you were really eager to do some other task and you wanted to devote a higher percentage of your time to that end, to that goal that you'd set for yourself, that's going to be better than saying, nope, I'm sorry, you've got to go and spend your time doing just this. And people will kind of argue with this and quibble and say, oh, but then kids will just go and they'll just play video games all the time. Well, some of them might, but if their autonomy comes with responsibility, then they can't just play video games all the time because they'll become homeless. So, it's a two-edged sword. Responsibility comes with autonomy and comes with freedom, and that will build character. And keeping people who are capable of more in a infantilized environment where they are just forced to go through the motions is not good for them. It's not good for anybody else. And what you end up having happen is, these people are capable of so much more, but they can't because they're restricted, and they graduate and they are not ready. And they could have spent the last 3 or 4 or 5 years becoming progressively more capable. And that happens to a degree, right? It's not a complete. It's not like public schools keeps people's development at zero. It just retards it tremendously from what it otherwise could be, which is not the same thing, but it accomplishes a very similar result in the end. And I remember thinking this, I was like maybe a junior in high school, and there was a guy who was a senior, and he didn't care. He didn't care about. I remember I was in the one class I was with him was like a literature class of some type, and so we were reading about the experience of Syrian immigrants to Ellis Island, and not to say that that topic doesn't matter at all, or that's not something somebody might find interesting or useful. I'm sure that there are people who are, and whatever. But you could be forgiven for this guy who didn't care about that at all to wonder, why the fuck am I here? What am I doing? Why do I have to go and spend 8 hours a day to learn this and other similarly uninteresting, inapplicable information, and then regurgitate that? And you're essentially regurgitating it so that the teacher can generate a test and then say, hey, look, I'm a good teacher because look at these test scores, which is essentially what was going on. Or so the school district can go to the state and say, look at our scores on this. The funds that you have been giving us have been justified, or that we've earned them because of our test scores here. So this guy was like, he already had a job. He was already working construction as a 17-year-old, and he was making really good money, way better money than the rest of us were making working part-time jobs at Burger King. And his line of thinking was, it would be better for me if, instead of going to school and spending the most of the daylight hours sitting in a classroom learning about Syrian immigrants or whatever else, then it would be for me to be out working, building decks and patios and garages and gaining experience that way, making money, working my way up in the industry. And I remember at the time thinking, what a fucking idiot. This guy just doesn't understand that brains over brawn, and education is more important, blah, 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 blah. The value of an education is intangible, and knowledge is power and blah blah blah, and he's just a Luddite and blah blah blah. And there was a lot of snobbery on my part. And I didn't say anything to him, obviously, but just in my opinion of him. And looking back, I have to say, like, he was 100% right. I mean, when he graduated, that's all he did anyway. He just went and started doing that job and working his way through that job. And all school did was retard that process. It restricted how much he could do. It restricted how much he could work. It was restricted the hours that he could work instead of starting when he was 14 or 15, which he very well could have done. He had to wait until he was 17, 18. And so it was a waste of his time, and then it was a waste of taxpayers' time, and the teacher's time, and he's in a class with a whole bunch of people who he's not interested in. So they're like, and this is kind of the fascinating thing is people will say stuff like, well, you have to have the government involved because what about poor people? What about people who there's a understanding that people from middle class or wealthy families, one way or another, those children are going to be educated. Whether their parents homeschool them or use tutors or use private schools or some combination of the three, that if your family's doing okay, that you're probably going to have sufficient education to navigate the world, and that is absolutely the case. But then people say, well, what about if you are, your family's poor or you're an orphan? And again, there's evidence that poor people can readily achieve this if they want to. Homeschooling does not necessarily cost that much. Most of basic instruction I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, I want my kid to take swimming lessons every day from a paid, master swimmer, and we need to spend time at the pool and spend time in the ice arena. There's a lot of the athletics, a lot of the sports can cost a lot of money. But if we're talking about learning to read, learning to code, learning to do math, like a lot of that stuff is for free now on the internet. And if a low income family is interested in advancing the educational opportunities of their children, they have options that are either very cheap or free. Um, but then there's the problem of what if they don't care about education? What if you have a low income family that does not value education, that does not care about it for whatever reason? It could be cultural reasons. It could be maybe they are just so busy with work or with their life, or maybe they're just themselves. Sometimes the parents are just so incapable on their own that they don't even think about their values or such. They don't care. Okay, well, in that situation, that kid is in a very bad situation. And the idea that, well, there's two problems here. First of all, if that's what you're talking about, then public schools should not be mandatory for everybody. They should be like welfare. They should exist and they should be there for people who can't get educated otherwise. If you come and say, hey, I can read, I can write, I'm relatively articulate, I know enough about our society, blah, 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 why would we force them to go to school? What's the rationale for doing that if they can already do the nominal educational requirements that people think that they need to learn in school, right? If somebody can go and say, I can pass these tests, I can do all of this, what's the argument? There is no, if the argument that we're doing this for the betterment of their education kind of goes out the window. It's pretty clear that that argument's not met. It should just be for welfare. It should just be for people. Then maybe you have orphans. It's not their fault. Their parents are dead, and they have no ability to. Okay, yeah. So have it there, be there for them. And that's how public schools got their start in the United States and in most countries. They didn't start by giving them to everybody. It was a welfare system for people who couldn't get educated on their own. And I defy anyone here who favors public schools to come up and tell me what's the argument for forcing people who are already educated or plausibly becoming educated on their own, independent of the school system. Why do they need to be involved? Why do they need to be forced to go? Why do they need to have their time taken? On top of that, why do they need to have their money taken to pay for it? Good question, huh? So I think the answer to this is that the ostensible reason people give for public schools is not the reason that they're actually funded, and certainly not the reason that they're compulsory. Public schools are meant to imprint the values and the ideology of who is paying for it, which in this case would be the state, onto as much of a population as possible. That's why it's compulsory. And that's why they don't just say, oh, well, if you know this stuff well enough, or if your parents are going to take care of it, then we will just let you go. Now, there's kind of loopholes in the laws. They do kind of let you go if you do homeschooling, if you can do private schooling. Now, the private schooling is accredited And so the private schools kind of have to ape what the public schools do to a very large extent. So they're not that different. And public school or homeschooling varies quite a bit from state to state. Many states really, really hate it. They absolutely, and this is true. I've told this story before, but like most public educators, especially at the administrative level, not necessarily at the teacher level, although many of them as well, uh, they really they get excited by the power that they have over people, and they look at every child in the area that they have, jurisdiction over as something that they have a deontological right to mold that child as they see fit to a point anyway. Now, most of them don't necessarily see themselves as having the right to mold them completely. They don't see themselves as parents necessarily, but that they have a responsibility delegated to them by the government to take those children and turn them to their will. And the idea that you could have children who escape that because they were homeschooled, or even private schooled in many cases, that really, really aggravates a lot of these administrators, especially, but sometimes teachers as well. They look at it like this person, they can justify it. They can say, look, I just want them to be well educated, and I just don't believe that the parents can educate the children as well as, professional teachers. And no amount of empirical studies showing that home educated people do better academically than non-home educated people will dissuade them of that. But, uh, well, they are aware of that, but then they'll pull up these other arguments. Well, it's to socialize people. I was having an interesting discussion with a friend of mine from New Zealand, and he was kind of explicit about this. He's like, the point of public schools is not that you learn certain things and that you get certain information that you can then use to, improve your life. Like it's some kind of not a jobs training program, but kind of a here's the basic knowledge of the world that's going to help you. Because as we know, it doesn't really do that. The information they teach you is of questionable value, right? The Syrian immigrants, the band, the sports, like there's a lot of this stuff that's not jobs training. It's not stuff that's directly applicable. And even if there's some value to it, and there's some value to everything, uh, to say that there's some value to something is not a justification for compelling everybody to take part in that, because there's lots of things that have value. Pretty much anything that you would choose to do would have some value, and it's a very open question about forcing somebody to do something and assuming that that's going to be the highest value for their ends. But his argument was, and I think this is much more true to the point, is that this is a way for, in his case, the New Zealand government to impose a national consciousness on its populace, to say, okay, all of you come together and you're all different and you're all individuals and you all have your own priorities and values and whatnot, but we are going to come and mold you to be good Kiwis, to be good New Zealand citizens. What that means, specifically, it depends on the system and whatnot, but it's going to eliminate some of the autonomy, eliminate some of the personality, eliminate some of the individuality, to be subordinate to some collective, usually the nation state, because these are states being paid for it. If you had religious schools, so famously you have these in Islam, but you also have Catholic schools, it's going to be for the Catholic body or for the Muslim body or for the Jewish body politic, right? These larger collective schools, whether they're public schools or private parochial schools, they're going to have that as an interest and they're going to put it in there. I think it's really only the purely private schools where you are paying and they are there to serve you. They are going to give you what you pay for. And if you say, hey, I want an education that's X, Y, and Z, then that's what they're going to do. And they're not going to try and pigeonhole in A, B, and C because that's not what you're paying them for. All right, that would be an extraneous cost. That would be something that they would not be so interested in doing. Um, in the case of public schools, the extraneous cost is the real thing. The things that they say they're going to teach you, the X, Y, and Z, the A, B, and C's, that is the rationalization, that is the justification uh, for the compulsion. That's that there's so much in government, in government services that are that it's extortion on the pretext of exchange. Oh, we're taking your money, we're taxing you, but we're doing it because we're going to give you a service. Whether or not you want that service, whether or not the service is provided well, blah, 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 that's the excuse. And with public schools, the excuse is we're going to teach you this stuff that you need to know. And so you have to come, because if you don't come, you'll be stupid. You'll be uneducated. And when you come and point out like, well, actually the curriculum that you're teaching is not really useful by and large, or 90% of it's not, or 95% or whatever. There a lot is taught in public schools, so I'm not prepared to say literally every single fact is useless. That's not true. In fact, I wouldn't say any fact is useless, but there is a very big question about whether any particular fact is worth someone's time. And also, like as I went into earlier, worth whose time? Like everyone's different. Some people, if you want to be, if you want to work in construction, yeah, a shop class might be pretty valuable to you. If you don't want to work in construction, a shop class might not be valuable to you at all. So that's the nominal excuse, but you know that that's not the real reason, because they're making it compulsory even for people who already know that stuff or who are not learning. And the fact that people are not learning it, the fact that people are going and they're not uh, retaining this information more than 1 or 2 weeks after the test, the fact that they're not using it when they get into into the higher levels of education, or when they go into the workforce, or in their private lives after this. Forget job training. How often do you use algebra? How often do you use geometry? How often do you recite Shakespeare because you had to read Shakespeare when you were in ninth grade English? It's not a dig on Shakespeare, but it's not necessarily for everybody, right? Um, Classical music's great. That doesn't mean you have to make everybody play the violin. In fact, that would kind of diminish it in a way. So it's clearly that that's not the reason. The real reason is that they can then control you, and they can try and impose their political will on you to some degree or another. Now, if they don't do a perfect job, it's not always that explicit. I don't think that your average public school teacher is getting like a memo saying, hey, your job is to make the kids into, obedient nationalists, but that's what the curriculum is. The entire point, and I had noticed this when I was in school, that the entire narrative of, say, like a U.S. history book or a world history book was the gradual increase in the power of the state as a beneficent, beneficial force. Uh, Crimes of the state were either completely omitted or kind of passed away as like, oh, that was a single mistake that we can blame on a single politician or something, and that's in the past. And now, and every so the New Deal, that was necessary, right? It wasn't the government's fault that there was a depression, and the government, came in to fix the depression. And the fact that the evidence for that is quite poor, and that the government is what caused the depression and exacerbated it, or at least this is something that even mainstream economists largely accept. It's contentious or whatever, but that's not the truth that's taught in the book. Um, you know, uh, that's the point. The government is not spending billions of dollars because they want to help you. They're spending billions of dollars because they want to mold you in a way that is beneficial to them. And I don't know if this was the plan all along, but then you have this group of people whose social skills are retarded. And I mean that literally, because in real life, when you're out in the world, you're not going to be in these similar age cohorts where it's a whole bunch of people who were born the same year as you. You're going to be interacting with people of all different ages and all different experiences. And taking people all the way up until they're almost 20 and keeping them in that kind of very isolated uh, and it's a very authoritarian system, right? You can't go to the bathroom unless the teacher tells you. You can't do anything without raising your hand. Right or wrong is based on what they tell you. And you are rewarded or disincentivized or stigmatized based on the degree that you conform, right? If you come and say, I don't agree with this, I think this is stupid, boom, 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 F, 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 you fail, you fail, you fail, detention, suspension, out, 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 stigmatized, stigmatized, stigmatized. Now, some people have sufficient social skills that they can go to detention all the time and still be popular and still have a good life. Like the system is not perfect in its oppression and its tyranny, but it definitely has an effect on the marginal person or on most people. And you get to this point where you turn 18 and you have no idea how to be an adult. You have no idea how to do anything. And this is not something, I'm not saying, oh, well, if we just had classes on how to be an adult. No, it's not about having classes. It's about gaining the experience, being responsible, having autonomy, having the freedom to fuck up and also to strive, right? Yes, it's true that if you have freedom, you might play video games a lot. You might go and eat Little Caesars a lot. You might make a lot of mistakes. You might have way too much sex. You might not work that much, blah, blah, blah. There's lots of mistakes you can make. But if you are responsible, you will have to pay for those mistakes, and you'll have to learn, okay, I shouldn't go out drinking every day just because I can. I shouldn't do drugs all the time just because I can. I shouldn't eat fast food all the time just because I can. I should maybe work more hours. Oh, if I work more, I have more money and blah, blah, blah. And to make more money, I need to be a good worker and I need to be reliable and I need to have good social skills and I need to be accountable and blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't happen when you have to go to school every day. It doesn't happen when you have to spend 40 hours a week going to a prison where you can't leave or you can't walk around. It is kind of like that. You walk through the hallways and the hall monitor, hey, what are you doing? What's going on? Where's your pass? Do you have a pass? Do you have a pass? You have a hall pass? Are you leaving the school early? You can't do that. No, the bell hasn't rung. You leave when the bell rings. It's quite dystopian, actually. It's normalized in our cultures to the point that we don't really question it. And you grow up, and many people have nostalgia for their youth, and so they kind of associate with their school, and they like going to the football games, and they had all their friends, and so school is this happy environment. But it's actually a terrible system that completely fails at its ostensible reasons for existing. And the true reasons why it's there are quite nefarious, right? So, congratulations to everyone who's finishing their high school. I hope you don't go to college unless you have a really compelling reason to do so. Like you're interested in doing a job that literally requires you to get a license that you can only get through college. Otherwise, congratulations on being done, and I hope that you can grow up quickly. So, I don't know, I think that's about it for now, and I'll talk to you all another day. Bye-bye.